A billionaire CEO walked into a ballroom in rags to see who would treat a man with nothing as still human, and what he found said more about the room than it did about him. The gala was the kind of Atlanta night that photographs loved. A sweep of black tuxedos and silk gowns, a ceiling of crystal chandeliers throwing a cold, white light over marble floors so polished you could see your face in them, waiters threaded between clusters of laughter and clinking glasses, trays of champagne like polished mirrors. The evening smelled of expensive perfume, roasted nuts, and something thinner. Navasa ambition. Hovering under the music, guests wore names like armor. Women with reputations tuned to a pitch. Men whose jackets seemed sewn from their business cards. A soft hum of wagers drifted from one high table to another. Someone said, half joking, "I bet half an hour till someone notices the charity display." The joke landed in the room like a small, dangerous thing. Outside, under a row of oaks that shook their leaves in light spring wind, a man in threadbare layers paused before the revolving doors. He had lived most of his life with skyscrapers, private planes. Headland saw coming to this piece of the city as anything less was a study in edge. He pulled his collar up against the chill. He had practiced the walk, the slump of the shoulders, the careful avoidance of eye contact. To everyone who would judge him by clothes, he wanted to be nothing. He wanted to see. Inside, the night pulsed on, the glittering current of people accustomed to being seen. They did not look for the unseen. He crossed the threshold and became, in the room's eyes, nothing more than an inconvenience. A ripple of attention, curiosity sharpened into contempt tracked him. A dropped napkin, a smirk, a conversation that paused to add a quiet, cruel bet. Someone near the bar tipped their wine into his palm, as a joke. A damp gesture meant to humiliate, before the security guards would usher him away. One of the younger guests, perhaps drunk on novelty, and a sense of having already won the evening, mimicked a begging posture for a photo. Laughter curt as a snapped purse strap. He felt each look like an assessment. Disposable? Expendable? A thing to be put through the margins and dismissed. The men in rags kept walking, head bowed, hands in pockets, a practiced smallness, across the room. Standing at a service station between the ballroom and the kitchen, Ara moved the way people used to say movement could be graceful without ceremony. Her hair was pulled back, a strip of flour dusted the cuff of her sleeve from the day's catering in the hotel's busy back room. She wore the standard uniform black skirt, white blouse, a strap with her name pinned to it, but the name tag was older than her tenure, and had a bend at one corner, where a pen had once clipped it. She had a smile that's soft when she poured out coffee, and a mouth that kept the corners honest when the guests made jokes that landed on the wrong side of cruelty. She had reasons to keep her head down. Her younger brother, Yalin, had a scholarship that covered part of his classes, but not the books. The landlord had reminded her, again, about the overdue line on the bill statement. Her shifts had a rhythm. Dinner, wash, overnight cleanup, 3 hours of sleep. Repeat. There were also good reasons she lifted her head. She carried a careful code of small, practical kindnesses she learned from her mother. Leftover soup for a neighbor, a ride home for someone stranded. A steady word for people whose days were grinding. It cost her time. Sometimes a missed break, often a little extra out of a pocket that did not have much to spare, but she measured worth in the quiet metric of shared warmth, not applause. When the man in rags shuffled into the ballroom a few feet from her station, Era saw him differently from most. She saw the way his hands trembled slightly when someone brushed past him, the way his shoes had slashed soles, the carefulness with which he tucked his chin. Maybe she noticed because she had learned to read small tells. Maybe she noticed because the idea of someone cold and hungry being treated like a spectacle made the taste of the evening sour in her mouth. Whatever the reason, she stepped away from the tower of champagne flutes and out of the practiced ballet of service. The room's laughter cut around her like wind. "Give him a coin," a voice called. "Pose with him, get a laugh." Another guest, a woman whose strawberry blonde hair made a bright island of attention, reached out to smear an expensive heel across the man's shoes, as if to test how low he might lean in gratitude. Someone else murmured that it would be funny to feed him a canape, and then say, "Enjoy, peasant." Mrs. Dalton, the event coordinator, watched from her podium with an expression that had learned the language of damage control. She had ordered the staff to keep visible distance. "We can't have interruptions. We've hired security for a reason." Marcus Reed, the head of security, stood near the door with hands folded, calibrated to respond to threats to the night's smooth surface. He had trained in a different kind of diplomacy of holding a room together, and his eyes tracked the man without stepping forward. Rules were rules. If someone caused a disturbance, their hands were to be guided out. If it was just a nuisance, discretion. Discretion now looked, to anyone watching with moral clarity, a refusal to intervene against the small crew. From a corner table, Darius Whitmer, an ambitious man whose smile never ceased to belong to a meeting, balanced his fork and watched the scene like a drama he had not yet monetized. Beside him, Vanessa Cole, a socialite whose handbags received as much attention as a minor work of art, laughed and whispered and showed the scene to a circle of guests as if unveiling a private joke. The room's mood was not ugly so much as performatively careless. Cruelty in this company was gilded and polite. Ara felt heat rise in her chest. Not for herself, but for the man who had no protection from performative cruelty. She did not think first about what other people might say. She thought about food and warmth and how even small gestures could change someone's evening. She knew the manager would scold her. She knew she might lose a tip if tips were distributed in a way that punished the brave. She also knew how a plate of hot food could steady a person for a night, perhaps long enough to make a better choice the next day. She walked into the current of laughter and found the man nearly at the service door, eyes lowered. "Excuse me, sir," she said, and her voice was steady. The words seemed simple enough, but in that room where voices curled around privilege, like a familiar scent, her invitation acted like a small rebellion. He looked up, his face much younger than the coat suggested. There was none of the arrogance she half expected to find in the worn features of a person reduced to this state. He held himself with a reserve that hinted at a different life that had been folded away. He said, quietly, "Thank you," with a voice that had been softened by weather and time, not with the rough edges of someone who had been only on the streets for long. "I'll get you something hot," she said. "We have stew in the back. Come with me." They moved into the kitchen like two different worlds, stepping through the same small door. The ballroom hush gave way to the kitchen's coarse music. A clang of pans, the high sizzle of oil, the rhythmic thump of a hand towel striking an apron. The air smelled of garlic, onion, and simmered tomato home smells that defied the shinier aromas of the Gala. The man sank into a back chair, as if his legs had forgotten how to hold him for long. Era set down a bowl and waited, hands gentle but efficient, watching the way he reached for the spoon. He ate slowly, like someone rediscovering the balance of salt and warmth. "You didn't have to do this," he said between spoonfuls. She shrugged as if it were ordinary. "It's food. It's not a blessing. Everyone eats." He smiled in a private way. "You make it sound simple." "It is," she said. "Sometimes people complicate things to hide their choices." Her eyes shifted to the thin line of his wrist where a faded watch had once been. "Are you okay?" "For now," he said. "Thank you." The kitchen was small, but not private. Every so often a chef's head popped through the swinging door and scowled at the diversion of labor. Plates needed to be run. Orders needed to be sent out. Mrs. Dalton's voice could be heard faintly through the corridor like an authority from a different climate. Still, in that bowl of stew, the man found a reprieve. Era had a habituan. She learned from necessity of offering more than what was asked. She could have left a quarter, a spare sandwich, a kind word, and returned to the ballroom. Instead, she fished into the inside pocket of her jacket and produced a folded bill. It was not large. People who had never known scarcity might have called it insignificant. To her, and to Yalden, it was enough to make a difference between worrying about a late light bill and having the assurance that the pantry would not go empty next week. She placed the bill on the paper napkin beside his bowl. "It'll help," she said, eyes steady and direct. "People don't always look. I know what that's like." He studied the money as if it were a strange coin gifted by an invisible world. "You shouldn't have," he told her, a sentence taped together from gratitude and a residual pride. "You didn't ask for it," she replied. "I'm not giving it because I pity you. I'm giving it because I've been lucky enough to learn what a small thing can mean." He looked up at her then, and, for a moment, something like recognition flickered in his expression. Not the kind that comes from name or fame, but a deeper sense that someone had chosen them for their humanity. He reached out with a hand that was gentle despite its calluses and pressed it against her knuckles. A quiet, borderline proper, human touch that said more than polite conversation. Outside the kitchen, laughter sputtered and glowed, the Gala moving on like an enormous animal whose heartbeat could be heard if you put your ear to its skin. Inside, there was a different rhythm. The clink of a spoon, the soft inhalation of someone who had been given warmth. "The man in rags said, in a voice small and steady, "I don't need to be touched by pity. I needed to see something real." Ara met his gaze, and the room narrowed to a point where only that honesty fit. "Then I'm glad you saw it," she said. He rolled the bill between his fingers, then folded it and slipped it into the inner seam of his jacket, as if the money were a talisman. He did not ask her anything about herself. He listened. He allowed the conversation to be simple, grounded. She talked about Jalen's chemistry homework, about a professor at the community college who assigned more than the syllabus seemed to demand. He nodded and smiled at the mention of small, stubborn commitments. There was an ease in the exchange, the way two people can become companionable without explanation when the world outside has been loud enough that such small acts feel like rescue. Between dishes clattering and the hiss of a grill, the man offered one sentence that arrested her. "People in this room will perform kindness when it benefits them. They will not, as a rule, give it without cameras." Era's face pinched not with judgment, but with a tired knowledge. "Then maybe they're not people we need to invite into our table," she said. "We can't choose where they sit at night. We can only choose how we sit when they're here." Her answer was practical and humane at once. She had built her own ethic from the fragments of a life that demanded practicality. He listened like someone taking notes. He introduced. No name. He did not explain where he had been, or how long he had lived with less. He kept his hands folded, his posture careful. When Mrs. Dalton's shadow fell across the swinging door, she sniffed and called, "Ara, you're needed on the floor." Ara wiped her hands on her apron and faced the doorway as if pulled up by the strings of an obligation. She felt the press of the room on the back of her neck. She did not look for applause. She looked at the man, at the napkin with the folded bill, at the steam rising from the empty bowl where comfort had been. "Take care of yourself," she said. He watched her go, and, when she was almost gone, he called softly, "Wait." She turned. Her hand still gripped the serving tray at her side, a quiet anchor to her world. He reached into his pocket and placed, without flourish, something flat and white onto the counter near where she stood. It was a slip of paper with a number on it and a small, polite instruction. "Call if you ever need someone to recommend you for classes. If assistance with tuition arose. If there was ever a reference to be written." The handwriting was neat, practiced, and unsigned. She frowned, confused. "Who?" she began. He smiled. "A private thing," and said, "Just a friend. For tonight?" His eyes held a hint of mischief. or maybe of sorrow, that had never quite been extinguished. My thanks. She took the slip, and folded it into the apron pocket she kept for notes. The card felt ordinary, but also dangerous. Like the knowledge that someone might know your name in a room you'd never be invited into otherwise. She slipped back into service, and the ballroom folded around her like a different weather. From where he sat in the dim corridor, he watched her move through the crowd. Efficient, unnoticed, present. He had done the thing he came to do: enter the room as nothing, and see who would offer a sliver of human respect. He had been both actor and observer, and both roles felt unsatisfying in ways he hadn't anticipated. There was a catch in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger or vanity. He had set up the test to measure honesty in others, but it had revealed something about himself. The capacity to orchestrate humility, and the cost that orchestration exacted. He knew, in a quiet, uncomfortable corner of his mind, that what he had done bordered on cruelty. Deceiving people into behaving badly for the sake of enlightenment was a luxury he could afford morally, but perhaps not soulfully. The room he watched from glittered, and he thought of a life built on displays and dispensations. The question that had sent him into rags the night before hung in his head still. How do you find someone who sees you as a person and not a position? He did not have an answer. Only small, fragile evidence. Ara had offered him more than a plate. She had offered him a relational currency. He had begun to hunger for recognition without agenda. When the clock in the hotel lobby nudged toward the hour, and guests rose to leave small clusters of compliments at the charity table, the man in rags moved toward the exit. He kept his shoulders squared so as not to attract pity. He had learned the art of appearing diminished, while keeping a fullness contained in a private place. At the revolving door, he paused, one hand on the brass rail, and watched the guests depart in their glittering sets of armor. Their faces were lit by the phone screens they used to document their lives. For them, the evening would exist later, as polished images, not as the small cruelties that had punctured it. Outside the abit. He drew his collar higher and, for a moment, wondered how many nights of this he could stand. He had come out to test others, and had found, unexpectedly, a test that might, instead, be for himself. Whether he could resist the urge to make a spectacle of human failing in order to teach a lesson. He had made a plan for a further step, one that would force the room to reckon with itself, but, as he moved away from the hotel steps, he felt the ethical weight of what that plan would require. He had allowed people's contempt to play out on a stage where they thought no consequences would touch them. That allowed him the kind of certainty only a privileged person could purchase. The ability to observe without being observed. He knew he would have to pay for that certainty with something like humility, or at least with the courage to accept the ways his experiment might be judged. Back inside the kitchen, Era had resumed the rhythm of service, yet she kept glancing at the apron pocket where the thin slip of paper lay. A small bright promise folded into a place that also held grease stains and pen marks. She told no one. Some things had to live as quiet choices before they could be explained. A pair of guests at a nearby table raised their glasses, as if to toast with the clink of crystal the virtue of an evening that had been, to them, harmless fun. The word harmless fell flat in the kitchen, where the line between entertainment and humiliation had been crossed, and could be counted in the small, honest acts of the people who had not looked away. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the man Mallet, Carter, who owned towers and newspapers and a cluster of philanthropic foundations, walked home under his raincoat and felt an unusual lightness. He had seen what he had come to see, and in that sight he found both sorrow and a strange relief. But relief did not erase the ache. He was not blind to the moral paradox of his experiment, using deception to unmask deception, performance to condemn performativity. He had justified it in his mind as a necessary cut to reveal something raw and true, yet the ethical skin of the choice had stung. He had not expected, in the midst of all that he had arranged, to be moved by a single human action, so wholly, without calculation. Era's gesture, simple and fierce in its ordinariness, unsettled him more than any boardroom battle. She had acted as though the man mattered. That mattered. On the drive back to his penthouse where glass windows reflected a city he had shaped, Mallet typed a number into his phone he had not planned to call. He paused, thumb hovering over the green icon, and then stopped himself. The decision to speak would alter a private experiment and place it in the open. It would demand intention beyond the thrill of discovery. He thought of the cost again. What it meant to place oneself above others to conduct a moral test. Even for what felt like noble reasons, part of him wanted to find Ara, and simply say, "Thank you," with nothing else attached. Part of him wanted to tell her everything, to unmask himself and force the room to answer for its cruelty, the middle ground where ethical thought and human affection, often tangled, felt both the most honest and the hardest to occupy. He put the phone down, at a table across town. Two of the guests who had pointed and laughed were already comparing the evening's most entertaining moments, scoring themselves with the mean little arithmetic of wealth. They did not know what they had missed and, perhaps, would never really understand. The man in rags, Mallet, had noticed this, and it created a quiet distance between him and those who assumed his life could be evaluated like a stock. In the kitchen, Ara closed the apron string, and, with the folded slip of paper warm against her palm, walked into the night. She did not know she had been chosen by anything more than a moment of compassion. She did not yet know the man whose life touched hers in a small slice of the evening would carry that moment into decisions that might change both their lives. She had done what her instincts demanded. She had treated another human as a person, not as a lesson or a prop. For now, that was enough. But beyond the gleam of the hotel's glass, and under the city lights, someone watched that evening, like a catalog, and stored it away with other evidence. He had respected her enough to remain unnamed in that kitchen, but there was an intention forming in him that would not so easily be set aside. He would test the room further. That much he knew, though the way he would do so and whether the cost of his test would be worth the result remained to be decided. He walked into the night, and in the quiet between the cars and the skyline, he thought about the power he wielded, and the responsibility that clung to it. The moral ledger of his experiment had entries on both sides. A genuine ache to find truth, and a disturbing willingness to manufacture conditions that would expose others' worst tendencies. He had to decide whether the revelation he sought could be achieved without making cruelty the entertainment he now detested. Inside her small apartment, Ara sat at a chipped kitchen table, and smoothed the slip of paper flat, as if it might bloom into something practical like a plan. On a corner of the table lay an overdue bill, a prescription bottle, and a biology textbook scuffed at the edges. The elements of her life were small and unglamorous. They fit more logically into a shape than any glamour ever had. She fed Yalan dinner and laughed at the way he insisted the pasta must be stirred counterclockwise for luck. Later, in the quiet, she tucked the folded slip into a book and went to sleep, imagining a semester where worry over tuition might loosen its hold for a moment. Across town, in an apartment that occupied the top floors of a building built to be admired, Mallet sat with the city spread beneath him, and considered things he had never had cause to weigh before. He had designed markets and measured risks. He had rarely measured the moral calculus of social experiments conducted on human beings. Tonight had split his clean assumptions like a fault line. He had watched a room laugh at a man who, in truth, was him. He had watched a woman treat that man with unbilled generosity. The difference between the two actions unsettled him. He had a plan, still only partly formed, a reveal that would confront the room with its choices and, in doing so, honor the one person who had acted with dignity. But he also knew that truth performed on a stage was not the same thing as justice. He could expose the crowd and be lauded for a spectacle of moral judgment, or he could find a smaller, quieter way to reward genuine humanity without humiliating the rest. Either course would carry consequences. He understood that his wealth gave him the freedom to choose a moral spectacle or a private restitutional luxuries that did not exist for the people whose lives he would touch. For now, the night had given him evidence. Ara had acted without cameras, without calculus, with an immediacy that suggested an ethic as stubborn as an old wound. She had chosen care. She had offered him a piece of herself without instruction. That, he thought, was the rarest currency. He called his driver, and told him to wait. There was a part of him that wanted to go back, to stand, unannounced, in the kitchen doorway, and watch the way she moved through life. There was a part of him that wanted to let the experiment end, and never speak of it again, to keep the knowledge as a private chastening. He told himself both things, and neither satisfied him fully. Before he made any decision, he wrote a note on a napkin, and folded it twice. He did not sign it. He slipped it into the same jacket he had discarded on the back of a chair earlier that night. The jacket smelled faintly of hotel soap, and the night's weather. It was a small, practical act, no more than a man busily preparing his next move, but it was also, for him, a moment when the experiment and the person intersected. He had set the rules. Now he felt the responsibility to revise them if they failed to serve the moral end he believed he sought. He had found what he had come to see. But discovery alone was not the end. It was the beginning of a choice about what to do with the knowledge that a single act of kindness could reveal the fault lines in a room full of mirrors. He understood that any next step would bear his signature, then and forever. Outside the hotel, the last limo slid away, and the chandeliers dimmed. Inside the service doors, the scent of stew and lemon lingered on pots, and in corners where memory could be made. Ira folded nothing in her pocket but the will to keep moving, and Mallet folded nothing but a tightening sense of responsibility that felt, for once, like a new weight he might be willing to carry. If this was an experiment about character, neither of them could yet see how the rest of the room would answer to the truth. The night had placed a seed in both their hands, and both were left, at different speeds, and with different tools, to water or to bury it. He could have made the reveal that very night, Mallet thought, theatrical ripping off of rags, the gasp, the applause that would seal an easy moral victory. He imagined the sharp crack of a microphone, the cameras trained on faces, suddenly finding shame. It would have been satisfying in the way spectacles are satisfying. Tidy, public, headline ready. But as he stood again before a room of glass and intention, Mallet felt the weight of what a spectacle would cost. He chose something different. A week after the gala, he arranged for a charity lecture to be held in the same hotel. The guest list read like a who's who of the city. Donors, board members, a sprinkling of influencers who could translate the evening into a feed. He booked the ballroom not to punish but to ask, at least. That was the argument he used to quiet his own conscience. He sent invitations with the same even-handed hand he used to sign checks. He asked for no cameras at the doors, no planned social media moment. Call it contrition or careful optics. Mallet did not have an answer he trusted. He only knew he wanted the room to see itself without the shield of anonymity. On the night of the lecture, the chandeliers came to life again, throwing a cool brilliance over the marble. Guests arrived with practiced smiles that had the soft creases of rehearsed kindness. Marcus Reed took up his post at the door. Posture perfect. A man who had spent decades translating potential chaos into acceptable edges. Mrs. Dalton hovered somewhere between stage manager and moral adjudicator. The evening's program was a list of worthy speakers and sober videos about homeless Hassan irony. To some ears, that made the room twitch. Mallet sat in the back row, not as a spectator, but as an actor who had chosen restraint. He had hired no flashbulbs. He had asked for only a microphone, and a single, honest sentence. When his name, long associated with donor plaques and capital projects, was announced, there was polite applause, the kind that weighs the right amount of gratitude against the right amount of distance. He walked to the stage in a suit that had been tailored to fit, not to impress but to be comfortable in its competence. He kept his eyes low for a moment, then raised them and met the crowd. He began without flourish. "I was in this room last week, dressed like a beggar," he said. The sentence landed in the hush, like a small stone. Faces shifted, phones were lowered as if the gravity of the claim tugged them. I wanted to see what people would do when the camera wasn't aimed and the benefits weren't obvious. There were the expected defense's laughs that tried to be light, murmurs that tried to be curious, but Mallet did not invite argument. He let the silence grow until each person in the room had to fill it with their own conscience. I won't rehearse my reasons, he continued. I will only say this. What I saw was predictable and painful. People laughed. They mocked. They treated someone as less than human, when there was no gain to be had. That is, on us. The tone in the room shifted. Some looked away. Others, like Vanessa Cole and Darius Whitmore, drew themselves into more rigid positions, as if preparing to defend past behavior. Vanessa had arrived, wearing a dress that made a statement. Now the statement felt like an accusation. Darius's jaw tightened. Ambition could be rarely separated from the fear of being judged. Mallet paused and then said, the one line that had landed like a refrain in his own thoughts since that night. Character is revealed in how you treat someone who appears to have nothing to offer you. He let it stand. He did not apologize for having posed the test. He could not pretend the deception had no moral costs. I understand, he added quietly, that using deception to test decency is a moral gray. I have no desire to pretend otherwise. I regret the hurt it caused. That admission he had planted it deliberately folded into the room and made the edges of applause complicated. Some people clapped. Some did not. Mallet's confession of ethical ambiguity did what he had been unable to do in his private thoughts. It named the cost aloud and opened him to the judgment that might follow. Then he did something the crowd had not seen coming. He did not call out the most vicious or the loudest. He called one name. There was one person who did not perform. She did not pretend to be moved for a camera. She acted because she could not bear the sight of cruelty, he said, and his voice softened toward the back of the room where a woman in a sensible coat was standing like she had the misfortune of being busy in the kitchen and late for her shift. Ara, he said. Heads turned. A hush moved through the auditorium like a hand. The name landed not as a social tag but as an honorific. An acknowledgement that the room had been too slow to give. Era felt, for an instant, as if the floor had dropped away. She had been finishing a double shift when a colleague nudged her and whispered that her name had been called. She had washed her hands, smoothed her apron, and walked into the light, aware everyone was watching. Mallet descended the stage, and walked through the chairs with the quiet composure of a man who had judged himself at least as harshly as he judged the crowd. Marcus watched him, eyes narrowed with professional curiosity, and Mallet nodded in thanks, the kind of nod that acknowledged the guard's role in holding an evening together, while also asking him to see a different truth. When Era reached the stage, she did not look like anyone expected her to. She was not performative or polished, only present. She had taken off her name tag and stuffed it in her pocket like a talisman. She stood slightly to the side, both grateful and disoriented. Mallet invited her to stand beside him, and then, with neither pomp nor pretense, told the room what she had done in the kitchen the week before. He spoke plainly about the bowl of stew, the folded bill, the slip of paper with a number, and a promise. He described how she had treated a man who appeared to have nothing as a person who deserved dignity. You did not ask for anything, he said to her, voice steady. You did this because you could not do otherwise. That matters. The crowd listened, not as a jury but as witnesses, for some, shame washed briefly across features they had thought immovable. Vanessa looked as if she had swallowed an apology she could not pronounce. Darius's expression folded into something like calculation. Social currency, he realized, could be lost and reminted, in different forms. Marcus kept his face a professional mask, but his shoulders unwound as if an old order had been nudged. Mallet stepped closer to Era N, with a theater-honed awareness of drama, reached into the pocket of his jacket. He produced the same napkin he had left in the kitchen. The ink on it now looked like the seed of something that might grow. He had added a card to it in the intervening days, a card with his name, number, and a short note. For someone who knows what true charity looks like, I would like to know you, if you will allow it. Meet me tomorrow evening at the cafe on East Broad. No press, no spectacle. He offered it to her with a respect that was almost formal. Era took it, and felt the slight tremor of a moment that had shifted her axis. She looked up at him, and for once there was no performance in either of their eyes, only the cautious recognition of possibility. There had been no promise in the gesture, only an invitation. The crowd applauded, some louder than others, but however loud the room became, it could not change what had already moved between the two of them. Mallet's reveal had been public. His sense of repair was quietly private. He had chosen to honor Era, without staging anyone else's humiliation. He had named the room's failure, and the one person who had not failed it. He had also, as he would later admit to himself and to others, saved some dignity for the people whose mistakes he had exposed. After the lecture, reporters circled like moths. Questions buzzed about ethics, about whether a rich man had the right to test the poor, about what constituted real charity. Mallet answered some. He deflected others. He let the conversation move in and out of headlines, and kept his focus on the smaller work, learning the contours of the life he had only glimpsed from the back of a ballroom. The meeting at the cafe the next evening was deliberately low-key. Era arrived early, hands still warm from a shift that had kept her on her feet. Mallet sat at a corner table, the way he arranged himself less like a mogul, and more like a man who had read too many scripts of his own behavior, and wanted to try a new line. They talked, first, about small things: the bland coffee, the weather, the city's stubborn potholes, then, gradually, about the things that mattered. Era's plans for finishing community college, Jalen's shy grin when he solved a chemistry problem, the way bills loomed like an uninvited landlord. Mallet listened as if cataloging data, but with a softness that made the act less like an audit and more like true attention. They spoke about the ethics of what had happened. Era did not want a charity narrative, where she played the grateful beneficiary. "I didn't do it for reward," she said. "I did it because I could not watch someone be made into a joke." Mallet nodded. "I know," he replied. "And I know my experiment had a cost. I've been thinking a lot about whether what I learned justified how I learned it. I don't have a clean answer." He met her eyes. "If you're angry, I'll accept it." She studied him for a long moment, and then, without drama, gave a small, practical laugh. "I'm not a moral ledger," she said. "If you want to make reparations, start by not making me an exhibit. Treat me like a person." He agreed. Over the next months, he kept that promise in small but significant ways. He invited her to dinners that were not announcements but ordinary conversations at Tuckle Place, on a side street, a weekday sandwich shop, a quiet family-run diner, where the jukebox still ate quarters. He visited her neighborhood, not to write it a check on arrival, but to understand how people there live. He attended a volunteer night at the community center, where Ara tutored teenagers. He asked questions with the genuine discomfiture of privilege, learning to listen instead of lecture. Era, for her part, moved carefully. She did not accept large handouts or gestures meant to buy her silence or complicity. She allowed Mallet to help fund a scholarship she had been wary of accepting, if it meant losing agency. Together they structured a plan. The scholarship would pay for tuition, but she would retain control over how the money was used, and the schedule she kept. She insisted on writing the terms. He signed them willingly, learning that generosity without boundaries could become another kind of erasure. not everything smoothed out. Their differences were real and, at times, difficult. Mallet's public life invited whispers. Colleagues questioned his judgment. Invitations arrived with subtext. Era navigated new attention while trying to remain anchored to the life she had built. They argued about small things that mattered, about how to respond when Vanessa Cole, who had posted a defensive statement about being misunderstood, tried to re-enter Mallet's orbit with a clumsy attempt at apology. Ara wanted Mallet to be firmer. He wanted to believe in redemption. They learned together how to set boundaries without becoming brittle. There were also tender moments. Mallet sitting through a community college lecture while Ara took notes, making mistakes on the material, and laughing at himself. Ara bringing Mallet into a kitchen to teach him how to make a stew she had perfected. His large hands awkward around a wooden spoon, the two of them folding and mailing care packages to families in Ara's neighborhood. These small rituals braided their lives together in ways that neither wealth nor status could manufacture. A public scandal did ripple through their lives when Darius, sensing an opportunity to burnish his own image, leaked a version of the story that painted Mallet as manipulative and Ara as a prop. The city's gossip columns feasted for a week. Ara, who had never asked for publicity, felt exposed. Mallet faced the consequence of his earlier choice. The deception that had started the whole thing now circled back as accusation. He sat in front of a bank of cameras one afternoon and said plainly, "I tested people. That was my mistake. The fact that I wanted to know how people behave when no one benefits from their generosity does not excuse the fact that I manufactured the conditions. I am sorry." There was critique, sharp and deserved, about power, imbalances, and the ethics of what he had done. Ara supported him in the precise way she had from the beginning, by reminding him that responsibility was a practice, not a momentary show of contrition. They used the scrutiny as a way to fund real programs sustainably, and to be transparent in how different projects would be administered. Mallet put structures into place: independent oversight, community advisory boards, and grants, managed by people who lived in the neighborhoods served. He had learned that restitution required accountability, not just money. Their courtship continued, not as a romance of rescue stories but as a partnership of people learning to meet each other honestly. There were awkward dinners where old money tried to test new generosity. There were quiet Sunday mornings where Mallet learned to do laundry because Ara had joked that he needed to know how to be useful. He learned small domestic things with an effort that made her laugh. The correct way to load a dishwasher, the finer points of managing a budget for groceries, the ritual of checking Jalen's homework. Months became a year. Ara finished a degree in biology, with a scholarship that Mallet helped secure, but never controlled. She enrolled in a program with the same stubborn independence she had always shown, applying for internships, taking a teaching assistant slot, picking up nights as a tutor, because she wanted the experience, not the headlines. Mallet sat in graduation chairs, clapped until his hands stung, and felt a pride that had no ticker tape. Their relationship deepened in the ways that matter. Through disagreements resolved with care, through shared projects that aligned with both their values, and through the private language of two people who had watched one another make mistakes and had decided to stay. They moved slowly toward commitments that were not performative but wholehearted. The proposal was small and intentional. He did not stage it on a rooftop or ask the cameras to capture the moment. Instead, on a rainy afternoon, he took her to the small patch of park where she used to bring Yalan when they could manage a free afternoon. The city's noise, soft under the rain. He got down on one knee, not in a gesture of entitlement, but of conversation, and said, with the awareness of someone who had been humbled by his own choices, "Will you partner with me in making a life that measures itself by how we treat others?" Era laughed at the wording. Practical. Slightly awkward, but she said yes, because the question had the gravity and honesty she wanted. Their wedding was modest. They booked a small hall in the neighborhood, filled it with people who had loved them honestly. Colleagues from the community college, friends from the catering team, a few family members who had watched their shifts and savings with tough affection, and people from Malet's world who had chosen, quietly, to be there without spectacle. There was no red carpet, no charity gala backdrop, no press release, only a band that played covers of songs that had soundtracked their awkward beginnings, and an uncle who toasted in a way that made everyone laugh. They decided, together, what matters would shape their parenting when that time came. Not to insulate the next generation with a gilded bubble, but to teach them what Ara had always known: how to measure worth in small actions and steady attention. When their child was born 2 years later, they named her Lila, a name Ara loved because it sounded like a color and a promise. They vowed to raise Lila in a home where people were seen, where privilege came with practice, and where honesty about mistakes was part of the curriculum. Malet continued to wrestle with the original act that had brought him to Ara. He spoke about it in public forums with an honesty that was rare for men of his platform. "I used my power to test others," he told an audience at a civic forum months later, "and I caused hurt. I hope to make better choices now, and that hope will be measured by the structures I leave behind, not just the speeches I give." He accepted critique. He learned, slowly, that contrition without action is a hollow thing. Ara taught him humility in 1,000 small ways that did not require him to be small. She insisted on agency for herself and for the people she served. She did not want to be the story's moral centerpiece. She wanted to be a person whose life and choices mattered on their own terms. Malet learned to let her be that person. He learned that love could not be bought or staged. It had to be tended. The public began to notice changes: education grants that were run by neighborhood panels, employment initiatives that focused on dignity rather than pity, and community liaisons who were paid to listen. Some critics remained unconvinced, and some of Malet's peers rolled their eyes. But there were also families who could now afford school books, young adults who found internships instead of temp jobs, and a small but stubborn improvement in the conversations at city council meetings. The city's narrative shifted in small increments enough to matter for the people whose lives had been touched. Years later, when friends and strangers asked Ara how she had known to act the night of the gala, she would say simply that she had not wanted to be the type of person who laughed at someone else's misfortune. She would tell them about the stew, and about folding a bill into a napkin, because scarcity teaches you the worth of small things. She would, if asked about Malet, speak of him as a person who had been willing to be humbled and to change. She never framed her life as rescued. She framed it as chosen. Malet, for his part, never stopped being asked whether his deception had been justified. He never offered a simple answer. "There was a cost to what I did," he told one interviewer quietly. "Deception is a dangerous tool. If I had to do it again, I would not. I would ask, instead, to be taught. If anything good came of my error, it was that it forced me to reckon with the kind of life I wanted to lead." He carried that sentence like a compass, imperfect but honest. People remembered the night, for different reasons. Some recalled the shame. Others remembered the single act of kindness that cut through a room's indifference. For Ara and Malet, the memory was less about the drama, and more about the work that followed. The repairs, the conversations, the steady practice of respect. When Lila was old enough to listen, Ara told her the truth in a way that did not spare complexity, that her father had once disguised himself, and that although the disguise had exposed the cruelty of others, it had also caused pain. "People do complicated things," Ara told Lila. "We hold them to account and we teach them to do better. That is part of being human." She wanted her daughter to know that kindness was not a commodity to be displayed, or a virtue to be used for performance. It was a habit. On the night Lila took her first steps, Malet watched from the floor and cried in the way men who are not used to tears sometimes do, sudden, surprised, grateful. He had been a man used to designing systems. He had learned that the most meaningful systems are those that honor people's dignity. Ara bent down and caught their daughter midway, laughing at the small drama of it all. Years later, in quiet moments, Mallet returned in his mind to the kitchen where it had begun. He remembered the smell of stew, the soft clatter of dishes, and the way Era's hand had rested on his knuckles. He remembered the feeling of being seen without the instruments of power. The memory was a kind of lodestar, a reminder that the shows he could produce with money were less valuable than the life he could build by listening. The city, too, changed in small increments. The conversations at galas became less performative for some. The people who had once been a chorus of derision found themselves, in later years, serving on boards that asked harder questions. Not everyone transformed. Vanity shrank in some corners and hardened in others. But the seed planted that night, one act of kindness noticed by a man who had sought truth in disguise, had produced, in its imperfect way, a different harvest. If there was a final lesson, it was this. The test he had staged revealed not only the crowd's faults, but also his own. The story that judged others first also judged himself. He had used deception to seek truth, and had learned that truth requires accountability, not theater. On a night years after the gala, Mallet walked with Ara and their daughter down a quiet street where the lights were small and honest. Lila clutched a paper boat she had made, and Era laughed when she insisted the boat could sail anywhere. Mallet slipped his hand into Era's and felt, without dramatics, a steady warmth. He thought about the beginning, how something like destiny had been nudged by choice, and how a man's wealth could either buy spectacle or fund repair. He thought about the cost of the path he had chosen, and the work that had followed. He had pretended to be a beggar, to study character. The real shock, the twist that had surprised everyone, was not that a billionaire could orchestrate a moral experiment. It was that a single, uncalculated act of dignity could alter how two people built a life together. The twist had not been only in discovery, but in the responsibility that discovery demanded. In the end, the story was not a neat morality play. It was a complicated human account. A man who had erred and learned, a woman who had acted without fanfare, and a city that had to answer for itself. It was also a quiet love that had grown not from pity but from shared labor, mutual respect, and the slow accretion of trust. If this tale carries any truth worth keeping, it is this. Appearances can be deceiving. Power can be wielded poorly, or with care, and real character is shown in the smallest acts. How we feed someone when no one is watching, how we defend someone when it's easier to laugh, how we choose to repair what we have broken. On a night made of appearances, true character and, eventually, true love was not bought or performed. It was revealed when a woman offered a bowl of stew, and a man chose to let that act change him. If this story moved you, like and subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear this.